Welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and as you can see, Gary Wayne is back, and we are going to talk about the Third Temple. And that is one of those subjects where I always keep loosely an eye on. And I have to say, there is a noticeable shift in rhetoric these days. And yeah, we are going into that. And welcome, Gary.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and always enjoy the discussions that we get into, because I think it's at the cutting edge of at least the topics that you like to talk about. They're at the cutting edge of what's happening in the world today, and always things that we ought to be keeping an eye on, because they tend to continue to advance in prominence, if, to put it in a simple sort of way. So when you're talking about keeping an eye on a possible third temple, that is one of those events that we need to try and keep an eye on and try and understand what the implications of that are and what it sort of takes to make that come about, because it's not easily done.
Yeah, that's true. So, Gary, before we jump into our conversation, how is the book doing?
Well, I'm my own worst enemy. I'm so obsessive. So I said to myself, I won't do a book that is as long as the first book, and I'm going to try and keep to that promise, but it may not be that much shorter. So I'm on chapter 65. I'm hoping for 75 to 80 chapters, and so it's going to be a little bit longer, kind of pushing it off for maybe completion for the fall, and we'll try and get it out before Christmas, with the publishing sort of chain of events that you have to go through to get things done. So, but I'm really having a lot of fun on it, and I think I know a lot of my followers are anxious to get their hands on the new book, because it mostly will focus on what's in the Bible about the giants, and it'll focus in what's in the Bible about the angels, and in the amount of volume and information that people might get taken aback from, because there's just so much information on that and how it connects into end time prophecy. And one of the things that I like to explain to people, and hopefully people sort of think about it, because it really sort of helped me understand a lot of the so-called allegories that are in a lot of the end time prophecy. And they are allegories, but they're all based on prehistory, and they're defined in the Old Testament. So if you get an understanding that your answers are there, and it'll help you to understand the chronology for end time. So I connect it to the end time in ways that people maybe haven't sort of thought about. It's not designed to be a complete chronology of the end time, but just give people a basis to understand the major organizations and kind of a flow of the events. And I also will explain my approach to prophecy that I think, I get a lot of interest in terms of how I approach prophecy, how I arrive at my understanding. So I have 10 guidelines that I tend to utilize that sort of I try and attribute it to, because it keeps you focused on maybe what you would like things to be, but it has to be what fits and doesn't contradict.
Okay, good. So the third temple, of course, that means there had to be a first and a second one. And when we look at that history, it has always been complicated, convoluted. King David wanted to build the temple. He wasn't allowed. He fought too many wars. Then Solomon did it. Then the first temple was destroyed. They went into Babylonian captivity. And then Cyrus the Great released them, and they went back, built the second one. Yeah, so it was never really a smooth story, was it?
No, it's not. And the story behind the temple, and it doesn't come for a long time until, as you said, David takes Jerusalem. And that doesn't happen in the conquest. That happens over 400 years later. And Jerusalem was held by the Jebusites, which were a hybrid Canaanite tribe. and it was heavily fortified as a rocky sort of castle or fortress, and on Mount Zion. Actually, there's two small mountains. There's Zion and Moriah there. So, but it's was not easily taken, and so there wasn't any temple for over 400 years, and so they had to do everything within the tent and the temporary quarters that were provided for the Ark of the Covenant and everything else. And then David, because he fought so many wars, so that you could have a time of peace for Solomon, he's not, even though he's after the heart of God, he's not the right individual that God wants to build the temple. So it's Solomon who he provides wisdom to, but it's not that Solomon stays as pure as what people would want to think, because he has something like 700 wives and concubines that all come for the most part from other nations that lead him astray, and starts actually, creating other altars and things for other gods in other locations. But he's the one that's, builds the temple, and he has so he must have had a repentance at some point, because he seems to be highly elevated within the scripture. So yeah, it's been, part of the curses of the covenant as opposed to the blessings. And in the covenant that was provided and sworn to by God with Israel, swearing to it, was that if they upheld the covenant, they'd have things through the blessings of the covenant. But they keep backsliding, and they keep sort of rebelling, and that's when the curses of the covenants come into play. So, you have the first significant application. You have other wars that they're going through their history, that they're having to repent, and then God helps them out again. But Assyria, one of the beast empires, expropriates in 721 BC all of the northern tribes, and they're lost into history from there. And then, as you mentioned, Babylon comes in and destroys Solomon's temple, again for a falling away, and as part of the curses of the covenant. And that's why you have the prophets. They're trying to warn Israel back from that. And then they get the second temple built after, as you said, Cyrus makes a decree, and the Darius allows them to finish, if I've got the right king there, but in the period of the Medes, anyways, when they're moving back. And then you have a falling away again, like they get sort of lost, and then you have the Romans overturning that temple. And so it's the most holy place for the Judaic people, but their ability to sort of keep it has been their own fault from the Holy Covenant perspective. And unfortunately, destiny, if you're a Christian or a Jewish person, unfortunately, the destiny of the Adamites, the destiny of Israel as a whole, and Christians as we're tied into it, has to be played out through the curses of the covenant, as opposed to what could have happened. And so one should expect a problematic third temple that is not really spoken of a whole bunch before the millennium. And so there's a different sort of temple that I think we probably need to focus on, that, the Muslim mosque that is located there now, or at least thought to be kind of located on where the old Jerusalem title was originally built.
Yeah. So just because you mentioned these more creepy undertakings of Solomon, so there's also a story out there that Solomon forced the demons to work on the temple. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting, and I think he may have had the power to do that if he wanted to do that. We don't get that biblically. We get that, I believe, out of the Quran and out of some polytheist sources, and particularly by the Gnostic sources that draft him into being this great black magician, right? What we do know is that the technology and the knowledge came from King Hiram of Tyre, who had the knowledge of the Dionysian builders, who had the knowledge of the antediluvian builders from before the flood. And I won't go through the whole history of how that comes down, but and this knowledge was used to build all of the major temples and palaces of the post-Diluvian period up to that time. And this will be the same knowledge that will pass down through Pythagoras and then into the Roman collegia. That's going to have a renaissance with the Templar knowledge that comes back from, you guessed it, the temple in Jerusalem that the Templars are. And there's a lot of documentation that they brought back this knowledge. And of course, the Gothic temples are the product of that knowledge, which is thought to be the same knowledge that was used to build the original temple. Maybe not the second temple. We're not sure where that knowledge comes from. And you've had in the second temple, you have a few sort of revisions of it. So you have Herod that makes it to the great temple that people sort of remember it as in the time of Jesus. So what else came with that knowledge to erect this great structure, right? And it could be the ability to control demons, or maybe Solomon had that as well. Certainly it would have taken a significant labor force to be able to do it, or they were using some other power or technology. One suspects, though, that Solomon, if he was using demons, that would be an unusual thing to build the most holiest site where the Ark of the Covenant is going to be and God's going to dwell. So I think he might have had the power to control demons, but I'm not convinced he used them to build the temple. But we only have outside sources that indicate that, and we don't know what that motivation is.
Yeah. So, and then, you know, when I was preparing for this interview, so I was thinking, how in the world am I frozen?
Nope.
No?
No, you're good.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, because I have everything frozen here.
Oh.
Okay.
No, you're coming through normal. No issues,
good.
no problems.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Sorry about that. So where the how did that come about? That yeah, there is a mosque now. Yeah. So and then I started digging into that, and I have to stop for a bit because nothing is reacting here anymore. Oh, now I'm back. Everything is okay.
Good.
Yeah.
It's usually me, when I do shows with people, they almost never ever have any issues, but it seems to be a lot of the shows that I do, there's technical glitches and things that people haven't seen before. So, but no, you've been perfectly clear on my end, and no freezing on my end.
Because I see you and I see myself in a smaller window, and you were frozen, I was frozen, and I thought, oh my goodness. Yeah, so okay, but so back to the subject. And yeah, wait. Yeah. And then I stumbled on this subject, that the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are two different things. This is usually here, the one with the golden top. Yep. That is usually the one that they are showing you. Yeah, when they talk about Al-Aqsa, but actually it is this one.
Yes.
And yeah, here you have it from an aerial view. Here the Dome of the Rock, and here the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And now, of course, that didn't slip by. And here are some, let's say, they are thinking about the fact if it's possible that they will destruct this one and build their temple there, and nobody will care because they always show them that one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the Dome of the Rock, if my memory is correctly, is the one where Abraham was doing the sacrifice of Isaac with, and I think. But you know what's also interesting is it may even be a temple that is even adjacent to maybe both of them. And if you look at Josephus's description in terms of his details where the temple was located, it seems to be a little bit different and a little bit closer to sort of the edge of the valley between the two mountains in Jerusalem, that where it was located. So I kind of think perhaps the Jewish people have the exact location somehow kept, or they'll use Josephus's descriptions that would match up with theirs to build not exactly on the site of the two temples, but even today, if you did that, that was, so to say, kind of adjacent to it, the Muslim people would probably have significant objection to it. But where I get my understanding of look for, other than Josephus, other than his descriptions, where I get my kind of gut feeling and understanding from that, it'll be an accommodation that's on a wing of the current temples. I'm not sure which direction from the pictures that would extend out. Where I get that from comes from Daniel 9:27 and Daniel 12:11. And in the King James Version Bible, it has it as an overspreading of the temple, where the sacrifices are going to be started in the first 3.5 years of the last 7 years. And that at the midpoint, Antichrist, after he comes to power, will stop those sacrifices and replace that with the abomination that causes desolations. So in the area, in the same places of the sacrifices, and something that would cause an actual sort of abomination, right? So we start put that together. Okay, what does the word overspreading mean? And that's the Hebrew word kanaf, Kanaph, as it's transliterated into English, number 3670. And that means an extremity or a wing of the temple. So that means there's going to be something built on. Now, it could be built on to the Aqsa Mosque and becomes something that's shared with as the Dome of the Rock, or it could be an extension of one of those two where the original temple and the Holy of Holies would have been located. And that really gets to be the key for the sacrifices, and particularly the feasts of the Lord. That includes Passover and all the other feasts that they used to celebrate. The sacrifices, particularly that Passover, was done either in the tent during the time of the Exodus or in the temple thereafter. And so that's kind of a requirement where they would want it to be, I think. And that would be definitely isolating where the Holy of Holies was located, which was in a very small portion of the overall temple.
So usually what goes with the third temple is that prophecy that the Jews will return to Israel. Yeah.
Yes.
You could argue, yes, to a certain degree that has happened with the state of Israel. But even here in Germany, we have a Jewish community. I'm sure you have one in Canada as well. We have Jewish communities in the United States, in Russia, wherever. So I don't think that the majority of them has the desire to go back. So how is that going to play out?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And so we get a number of sort of events that we need to keep in mind in terms of this. And everybody sort of jumps into prophecy, not with an open view, but more of a preconceived understanding of how it sort of finishes. And there's a lot of details on how you get from point A to point B. So the prophecies about the southern kingdom of Judah being in Israel in the end time are accurate. And there are people, as are described in, Ezekiel 38 and 39, in time of the Gog War, that's a little bit after the start of the last 7 years. I mean, they've come from many sort of nations. They've returned, right? And part of the curses of the covenant was the exile, not only of Israel, but the exile of Judea. So has to do with their return. Now, their full return happens later than when the start of the last 7 years would be. So, and I'll sort of get there in terms of how this is going to happen in a couple of minutes. But you have another piece to the end time prophecy that all prophecy tends to center around, and that tends to be controlling the city of Jerusalem. And that doesn't happen until 1967, as opposed to the Declaration of Independence in 1947 and the war in 1948. And in Jesus' oration, he mentioned all of these chronological order of events, and that it would happen in the fig tree generation.
Mm-hmm.
And just as Jesus kills the fig tree as he enters, he's going into Jerusalem after he has a fruit, and then he starts to talk about some of the end time things like the destruction of the temple, for example, and then afterwards the oration that he does to the disciples who ask him about the order. Fig tree is a prophetic allegory for the southern kingdom. That is Judah, and that fig tree is in Jerusalem, and everything important that happens in prophecy sort of centers around Judah and Israel and Jerusalem. So when you have that sort of understanding, then we don't know how long a generation is. You've got 40 years in the Exodus, you've got 70 years in the Psalms, you've got 120 years in Genesis 6:3. So, but with whatever the length of that generation is, and if there is a starting point to the fig tree generation, you might look towards 1967 and say that we're in the beginning of sorrows for the end time. It's beginning to kind of look that way, but we'll have to wait and see. So Israel is going to have to awaken from their lostness into the Gentile nations from the four corners of the earth. So that event has to happen, and they're going to be called by name in an event that is known as the second Exodus that happens in the last 3.5 years. And it happens in the year of the Lord's favor, as talked about in Luke 4 and Isaiah 61 or 62. And this is a year that happens before the Armageddon, the year of the Lord's wrath and the wrath bowls. And so sometime after the midpoint, you're going to have an exodus of not only awakened Israel, but visible Judah around the world that are going to meet the people who fled Jerusalem and Judea at the time of the abomination at the midpoint, that are being protected in the wilderness for 3.5 years, as Revelation 12 describes. So yes, they will have to be there for all of this, and for Ezekiel 39 and the resurrection sequence of all of Israel, which is the dry bones, which is also has a second Exodus passage into it, starting in about verse 12 or 13, where it talks about second Exodus, where they'll join and they'll become one rod. So now if we have that sort of understanding, then you have this beginning of the sacrifices that's going to happen before this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to have all of Judea in the covenant land for this to happen. And so what you need is you need something that is going to happen that will permit the building of this new temple, or a smaller version that's built on as a wing onto the current location of the Dome of the Rock and the Al Masca Mosque as well. So I think we have to sort of keep all of that in mind in terms of, does all of Judah have to be there when this happens? Prophecy doesn't say that. What it says is there are people there, and that they're in control of Jerusalem. They're at the end of the sacrifices, but you also have Judea and lost Israel brought in from around the world. That happens after Antichrist comes to power. So we don't want to conflate some of the prophecies and the things as we're looking at that.
Yeah. So I will briefly go back to this image. And so when I saw this, and you see here on the left hand, this window.
Yep.
Can you see that?
Yep. It's a circular window. Yep.
Yeah, the circular window. And somehow I had to think of the Knights Templar when I saw that. I'm not saying it is their style, but it just reminded me of them. And then I thought, yeah, the Temple Mount itself, it changed hands a couple of times between Muslims and Christians, and they rededicated the buildings to their purposes. And it also said that the Knights Templar had their headquarter in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as we have seen, the one with the circular window is the actual Al-Aqsa Mosque. The other one, the Dome of the Rock, is Al-Saqra.
Yeah, and you have you have a temple where the Knights Templar were centered at. They lived in the court palace that Baldwin the First and Baldwin the Second provided. But their headquarters was, and also where the kings of Jerusalem were kind of elected, were in a small priory on the rock of Zion. And this is thought to be, and I write about this in my upcoming book, that when the Templars took over, they relished the Temple of Mary, where Mary's house was thought to be on Mount Zion, and that that's where the Last Supper was. And so this had a very small temple that was built on it, small priory, and Godfrey thought it was too humble. It didn't reflect the royal magnificence that it ought to have had, and that they built this other significant temple on that site, and that was sort of their center. And then they built another one out in Bethlehem, which was also a Notre Dame de Sion of Bethlehem. And so Sion is the French transliteration for the word Zion. And so the Priory of Sion, all the same sort of imagery that's being involved. That temple, though, in I think 1291, as I recall, was destroyed. I don't have anything to say that it was completely destroyed. So maybe it was rebuilt again using some of the Templar walls and maybe the front. I mean, I'd have to do a little bit more research on that. So it's a possibility that they had, that is the same temple, but that wouldn't be necessarily where the original Temple of Solomon was.
Okay, so
that would have been more on Mount Moriah, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and which is a different location for these are. But they would have built several temples in Jerusalem as well during their occupation with the kings of Jerusalem.
Yeah. So we also have an idea out there that actually the Wailing Wall and all that is the leftovers of a Roman garrison, Fort Antonia. So what do you make of that? Do you think there is any credibility?
Yeah, so much goes into legend and mythos without having the true history to sort of back it up. So, the standard mythos is the Wailing Wall is the original wall of Herod's temple, not of Solomon's temple, but of Herod's temple that he built. And certainly Herod had the support of the Roman Empire and would have had maybe Roman technology that's in it. So you roll that forward to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and is that a leftover of Herod's temple as a temple wall, or is it a Roman one? You wouldn't really know from probably the construction, because it would have been the same technology. So it's hard to know whether or not that is actually the true wall of Herod's temple. But again, the wall of Herod's temple, it was huge, and it had a significant area as to where the small location of the Holy of Holies would have been located in a little bit larger temple that would have been the original temple that was built after Judea came back from Babylon. Probably is in a, maybe not as close to that wall as what people might think. So, and just the way things have been done in the last 2,000 years, whether it's bones of saints or relics or this or that, there seems to be more hoaxes in there than actual facts. So, do I like to think of it as being the walls of the temple? Sure, but I don't know whether I would go too far out on a limb to say, hey, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. I mean, so many times things have been plastered over there and then destroyed again in another building, and who knows which wall is which.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like saying, is the shroud the temple, is the shroud that Jesus used? And I'm going, well, it sure is nice to think of that might be what would happen, but we have very little proof to suggest that is the case. I mean, nobody knows how it was done, which sort of, adds to the mystery, but we don't have that smoking gun proof. And so I'd like to think it is, but I wouldn't put my faith on that or get too far out on a limb on that, which I tend not to try and do on things that I can't verify.
This Herod, I find he is a very strange and creepy guy. He might have Jewish roots, but to me,
he doesn't.
It feels as if he thinks he is a Roman.
Well, yeah, he was put in power by the Romans, and
that explains it.
And he's Edomite. And so in the time of the Roman and the Greek rules, you have an absorption of the Edomites into the Judaic nation and to follow their laws and things, but they still have their bloodlines of their kings. And he comes from the Edomite bloodline, and he marries into the Maccabees and gets access to the throne with the power and backed by the power of Rome to do that. So he actually sort of usurps the Maccabee dynasty, and he's actually Edomite. And that goes back to the bloodlines of, the original Rephaim and Horim that intermarried with the Edomites in the Mount Seir area. So yeah, he's an interesting individual that is not Jewish and was leading the Jewish nation, at the time of the birth of Christ. And then just as the Amalekites wanted to wipe Israel from the face of the earth in the time of the Exodus, and that is a nation that is created through the offspring of a daughter of Seir, who is the chief of the Edomite Rephaim or the Horim. His daughter Timnah is going to marry the son of Esau, which is Eliphaz, and they're going to produce Amalek and create this hybrid human race that is going to become that race of Amalekites, which are the people that want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And if they were to succeed, they would, in their belief system at that time, they would have inherited all of the blessing rights and the Messianic rights and the inheritance that they believe that Jacob stole from Esau, which he does. He tricks Esau in the biblical stories, and they're trying to earn that back. So now you have this Edomite king that comes out of those bloodlines that had done this to Israel during the time of the Exodus and were an arch enemy of Israel through the early years of their nation, and even into the time of King David, they're still there. And David has to mop up, with the wars that he was doing that we talked about earlier. So you have this Edomite king who's trying to murder the Messiah. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's just, you have this history that is, you have to understand the bloodlines and the history to know what's going on. So he looked at that as a significant, not only political risk to his ruling and a danger to him losing control, but also he would have been saying, hey, I need to make sure this doesn't happen for my sake of my bloodline and my own stake that I have in it. And Herod goes back to a name that actually means sort of a hero. I mean, and it was a very famous name before his generation. And so a Herodian is very much thought of in the terms of the heroes of Greek mythology, which were the Nephilim.
When we have a couple of well, that one very famous event where Jesus whips out the money changers from the temple. And so when I listen, when I read those events, and I always thought, and that is just my personal impression, that Jesus was more a guy that, pointed out, guys, actually, you know what? The temple is all good and fine, but it's not really in the building. It's something else. It has to do with you, not the building per se. So that I always felt that he underlined that.
Yeah, because the physical world is a temporary thing, and for you to enter into the kingdom of God, you have to start with yourself. And to make yourself, sort of whole within God and within Jesus to sort of make that happen. And that, you have a symbol at that point in time of the Holy of Holies. We don't get really examples of God speaking to the rabbis in the time of the temple. In the time of the original Solomon priests, they wore vests that had 12 jewels on it, and there was a communication through those vests and the lighting of the jewels that would provide instructions or answers to some questions. There was a communication that was sort of lost along with the ark that's no longer there. So you had a replication in the second temple, but you didn't have all of those things where God was actually dwelling there. And so it was a sort of a representation of the first temple, but not in the same spirit of it in terms of having that complete dynamic. But even so, it was considered a place that was holy and everything that was sort of around on it. And in the spirit of that, that's what I think Jesus took exception to, is how their falling back had manifested in doing the things that they were doing around the temple.
Yeah, just because you mentioned that it's a holy site, later on I pulled up some more articles to see how, so that we can have a look how the rhetoric has changed. And in one of those articles, there are some Muslim imams mentioned, and they said something along the lines of, yeah, well, actually, for the Muslims, the Dome of the Rock is the third holiest place, and they should focus on Mecca.
Yes.
And to me, that is so strange that people think there is a hierarchy to holy places.
Yeah.
You are the holiest one, and you're second. No, you are third. What is that?
Well, they recognize Abraham as being a very holy person, and the Quran talks very favorably of Abraham and all of the patriarchs in the Bible. But that's not who their prophet is, right? So their prophet is more associated with Medina and his ascension to heaven is pictured as theirs. So they would the Muslims would probably consider Moses more important to them than Abraham, right? And what's interesting about Moses is that, I mean, that's the intersection of Christianity and Islam and Judaism. So kind of look for, things about Moses to come about to sort of make him more into a polytheist from being educated at Heliopolis, as being adopted into the pharaoh family. He would have been initiated into the mysteries at Heliopolis, and that he was a polytheist. I would expect to see more of that coming into play. But what is interesting, though, is that they tend to, the Muslims tend to put more focus on Quran-driven things and Hadith-driven things than on Jerusalem. So it's important to them because of Abraham and David. They look at David and they look at Solomon in very high levels of degree, and the prophets that were of Judea and Israel. So it's important to them because the Quran kind of builds off of what's written in the Old and the New Testament. I know a lot of people won't like me saying that, but I mean, it basically says that everything that's written in the Bible is true. And if that's the case, then and they're worshiping the same God, which they say they are, then you would want to sort of view things through what the Bible says to understand what's written in the Quran. And that this is a scripture that was sent for them, and that this is a special sort of covenant and a scripture. So they would be related sort of on that basis. So yeah, they have a hierarchy of holy places, which is not really sort of biblical, right? You have the Holy of Holies only because that's where God was dwelling, and that is in God's holy city, which then, if they recognize that Jerusalem is God's holy city, then why wouldn't that be the top of the hierarchy? It gets into contradictions. So it's kind of, but that's because of the biases to elevate the Quran as the sort of, not the supreme writing, because the Quran is interpreted by the various hadiths. So that tends to be the supreme writing on it in terms of how they would set up that hierarchy, I think.
Yeah. So now we have, Gary, is there a clear Bible prophecy that the third temple will come?
There's debate on that, which is kind of surprising. Yeah. So there's let's get the one that is not the temple of the end time off the table. So you have in the book of Ezekiel, at the end of the book of Ezekiel, of the building of this great and fabulous temple. And this is after all the tribes are gathered back together. This is the temple of the millennium. So that happens after Armageddon, so not the one in the end time. The only place that we get references to the end time temple is in a couple of end time prophecies in the book of Daniel to begin with, where you have the sacrifices that will be permitted, which have to be in the temple, and is then replaced by where the abomination is going to go by the Antichrist that we talked about at the midpoint. So you get those prophecies. You also get a prophecy in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 which is about the rise of the Antichrist, and where he sets him up in the temple to be like God and to be worshiped like God, right? So you have that as a reference to a temple.
But it doesn't specifically say which temple.
Well, you have to be careful, because when they do the abomination, that is something absolutely abominable to God in that location, which is thought to be the temple. And then you have, in the book of Revelation, you have the mark of the beast and the image of the beast that is located in that temple. And so all of it sort of goes to be, it's the abomination that causes the desolations, which is the wrath, which is the last 3.5 years with the wrath bowls coming out in the last. So does it say it is God's holy temple? No, it does not, because it's only going to be at the site of that. It's not going to be the sort of third temple. It's chronologically, it'll be the third temple, but the third temple is thought of the millennium one. And this is something that is done to enable the world government and the universal religion, which it will take to permit this, to have the protection of, we'll call it the modern nation of Israel, being protected and guaranteed by the world government. That happens in Daniel 9:27, where now it is permitted to have the sacrifices for the first 3.5 years, on a overspreading of the temple, on a wing of the temple. So yes, you get that connection, but it's thought to be where the Holy of Holies was being, and it could be a very, very non-magnificent building. It might even be outside for all we know. Right? But it is connected to the end time temple where all of this goes on, and we already have a temple on there. And that's where I sort of link in with, on the wing or the extremity or the overspreading is going to be sort of just adjacent to it.
So if I understood correctly, the moment where the sacrifices are allowed, that will not be a good sign.
No, it's and God will annul that covenant that permits it. And actually, the people of Jerusalem, or the people of Judea, will be looking at the one who negotiates this as being their coming Messiah, who starts his ascent to power, as being kind of relatively, I think, unknown at the time of the negotiations, but gains great fame after that. And then they realize that when he ends the sacrifice, as Jesus says, look to what Daniel says on this with the abomination, that it's time to flee, because they'll recognize then that, hey, we were guaranteed peace, we were guaranteed to be able to do these sacrifices. Now he's the one who stops it, and he's crowning himself as God in the temple and on the location where we were doing the sacrifices.
Many years ago, when I still had a TV, I was, flipping through the channels, and then I stumbled on something that called itself a God TV. And they had a lot of trips to Israel, and were constantly there, and they were reporting from Israel. And when you listen to them, they couldn't wait for the third temple. They were head over heels over that. So I don't get it, because isn't that, why look forward to that?
Well, it's being looked forward to in sort of two lenses. From a Judaic and Christian perspective, you have the Judaic dream that the Messiah is finally coming back to establish his kingdom and rule, that will set them in a very sort of privileged position when that happens. And so they look forward to that after millennia and millennia of persecution and difficulties in the world. They're looking forward to that. And Christians look forward to that because that's going to be, the time of rapture, and moving into the millennium as well. But nobody should look forward to being part of the end time. It will be absolutely horrific. And the horrible things that go through it. I mean, it's just crazy why somebody, other than, it might be interesting to witness history, but you're not guaranteed you're not going to be the one that's killed in the wars or in the persecution. And so my advice for people is recognize that we might be in the signs of the time, but boy, if you think that God's going to come and save you from all of the things that are going to happen, no, that's probably not going to happen. We have to go through tribulation, and the end time tribulation is significant, and then comes the wrath. And that's the thing that Christians don't really properly distinguish, in my opinion, is that the tribulation is not the wrath bowls. And the tribulation is horrific. And there's a couple of tribulations, and it's the second tribulation that leads up to the pouring of the wrath bowls. And then there's going to be tribulation that's even before the last 7 years. And, Revelation 2, 8 to 9, as I recall, talks about 10 days, just as you have a week of years, and you have 10 years of tribulation. So there's going to be tribulation with the rise of the universal religion first, just as we're going to see lower levels of tribulation as the birth pangs and the beginning of sorrows get stronger. So it just gets increasingly worse, and it's going to be very confusing because people are going to say, well, this happened, so this is when Jesus is coming, or this is when Armageddon is coming. And it will cause the discrediting of Christians en masse. Do not get ahead of biblical chronology. Things have to happen. And, before we can get into that last 7 years, before you can get into the sacrificing of the being permitted on a wing of the temple, is you have to have the 10 kings, and you have to have the universal religion. And so we're building towards that. But we're not there yet.
You and I, we have talked about that a couple of times, and I totally agree. And I think it's really a disservice to Christianity, because, after a while, if you call out Armageddon or any of it every 10 minutes, you come up with another date, and no, it's September, no, it's October, and people will no longer listen to you. They will think of you as a nut.
Yes. And if you look at the catastrophes as getting stronger as you go, as in the sort of the definition of the birth pangs, which is the sorrows are. And you've got wars and rumors of war, you've got pestilence, you've got famine, and you've got earthquakes. And that they're going to be working together. And they're not all working together yet, but we're starting to see more of it. And it's going to present, as they get stronger, the ability for this universal religion to step in. And it's going to allow the world government to form, which has the 10 kings of groups of nations. You're seeing kind of a shuffling of that right now, for example, with Putin trying to reestablish his Putyanin original Kievan Tsar bloodline empire that extends, into the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states right up to the Baltic Sea. And you'll see Xi doing the same thing with him, trying to get the full expanse of sort of nature to the old Chinese dynasties. And he comes out of the Shah, which is Z is the short form of XIA, which was the western branch of the Li bloodline and the Shah tribe that produced all of the dynasties before communism in China. And so you're going to see things come out of that that's going to look like World War III. But it's not. You're going to might even think it looks like Armageddon, but it's not. And, by the time you get to the opening of the seals that happens about at the, the 7-year mark at the time of the covenant, you're going to have a significant war. It's got to be a huge war that is talked about in the seals, where People are going to be killed by the sword, and 25% of the earth is destroyed, 25% of the waters and the vegetation and the people are killed. But then you've got the 200 million man war, which is also in Revelation 9 and in the trumpets and in Joel 1 and 2 and Ezekiel 38 and 39, that you're going to have 33% destruction of the people on the earth and the waters and things that go along with it. We're still not on Armageddon. We're just at the war that Antichrist will utilize as his Armageddon against another Antichrist type figure and make his claims to being the true Messiah so he can be crowned in the temple. So as Luke, the book of Luke talks about and the book of Daniel talks about, that's when Antichrist brings his armies around Jerusalem and he sets up the abomination in the temple and starts his 3.5-year reign. So, and then after that, there's going to be wars in the time of Antichrist, and then you get to Armageddon. So, which it would be 100% destruction, except that according to New Testament prophecy, Jesus will come in and stop the total destruction of the earth. Otherwise, no flesh would be saved.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something where that I wondered about, because here, when they reported from Israel, it was always as if they were really convinced this will be the true temple where the true God, you know, the third temple is dwelling, and it sounded, I don't know, it didn't sit well with me.
Yeah, and I get the motivation, but you know, again, I would advise Jewish people, don't get too far ahead of biblical prophecy, even Old Testament prophecy, like you did at the coming of the time of Jesus. I know they don't accept Jesus at this point, but don't get too far ahead and don't ignore inconvenient prophecies, even if you're just using the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a great first hour. I have to say, we covered a lot of ground, and we have covered the history. And now we will go into our modern times and what we can see and what is developing. So to the non-patrons, goodbye, and we see the other patrons on the other side. Bye-bye.